This presentation will focus on the concept of vital events as they occur within demographic studies. In the field of demography, there are only three major vital events of interest, and those are births, deaths, and migration, because those are the three things that are going to dictate the size of populations as well as the growth rate of populations. And in fact, we're going to be focusing more on the latter in terms of rates when it comes to looking at all three of these vital events. We look at crude rates that are vital events relative to the total population, and when we also look at specific rates that are relative to subaggregate levels. There we go back to the concept of population structure and looking at subpopulations. Demographers examine something called the annual crude death rate, which is simply the number of deaths per 1,000 people. And the formula for that, as you could probably guess, the CDR, crude death rate, equals the number of deaths over the population times 1,000. And we'll see the same basic formula applied to the other rates as well as we go through those. But we don't just examine the overall crude death rate for the whole population. It's also possible to study the age-specific death rates. For example, demographers are interested in particularly infant mortality rates and also early childhood death rates. And so when we look at the age-specific death rate formula, we have the number of deaths within a particular subpopulation relative to the particular subpopulation times 1,000. So it's not a lot different than the crude death rate. It's just for a particular subpopulation, not the whole population. Place-specific rates, we could look at, instead of looking maybe at cultural characteristics, we could look at regional characteristics of a country. We could look at north versus south, urban versus rural. Any type of place comparison could be done. And the same basic formula would apply. We would look at the death rate relative to the place over the population of the place. And that would be a similar kind of function. And next we can look at birth rates, and what we'll see is a parallel set of ideas, beginning with the annual crude birth rate, which is taken as the number of births per 1,000 people. And the formula for that looks very familiar if you were looking at the crude death rate. We replace deaths with births. So it's births over population times 1,000. We can look at those for the whole population, or we can look at those for specific groups. And again, age-specific groups are, of course, going to be of interest. Age-specific birth rate is perhaps more meaningful because birth rates are specific to particular age ranges. There's a very confined number of years where births take place, for instance, right? So you're going to probably want to look at the gender and age-specific population of females who are between the ages of 15 and 40. Because that captures about 99% of the birth that takes place. And again, the equation for that is just going to be the number of births for the particular subpopulation relative to the size of that subpopulation times 1,000. And we can again do place comparisons, as we mentioned, with the crude and the group-specific death rates. When we look at migration rates, this is slightly different than the birth and death rate because we're really dealing with two concepts. And that is the flow of people coming into a particular population and also the flow of people going out of a particular population. So we tend to study just the overall net migration rate, which, as you can see here, is the crude migration rate for the whole population is the in-migration minus the out-migration relative to the population times 1,000. We can also look at that by different subpopulations. Of course, of interest here are age-specific migration rates because people, they tend to move at particular age, well, really different life course periods. For example, there's an upswing in retirement migration in the United States. There's also a great deal of migration that happens for younger people as they are mobile and looking for careers and those kinds of things. So the age-specific migration rate, again, is just going to be the same type of equation as the annual accrued migration rate, but for a particular subpopulation defined by age. We could also look at this in terms of this sex-specific migration rate. We could look at it as racial or ethnic specific migration rates. All of these are going to be of interest at different points of time. And again, we can also do the place-specific comparisons. This may be even more relevant when we're focusing on migration because, we're of course interested in movement from one place to another, such as between regions of the world or within particular countries. For example, in the United States, there's a lot of movement from the north to the south and from the east to the west. And finally, when we put these three vital events together, the birth rate, the death rate, the migration rate, we can look at the fundamental equation of demography, which is population as a function of births minus deaths plus migration, which is in migration and out migration.